Welcome. I'm Sean Adams. I'm Professor of New Testament and Ancient Culture at the University of Glasgow, and I'm currently Head of Theology and Religious Studies. Today's discussion is part of the Hope Against Hope series created by the Theology and Religious Studies Department at the University of Glasgow as part of our engagement with COP26. Today, I'm joined by three lovely colleagues, each of whom has an interest and expertise in the study of the Bible and the environment. So first is Dr. Suzanna Miller. She's Chancellor Fellow in Hebrew Bible and Old Testament at the University of Edinburgh. She's interested in both wisdom literature and ecological justice, particularly as it relates to non-human participants. She brings these concerns together in her work as chair of the Animals and the Bible Research Group for the European Association of Biblical Studies, and in her interdisciplinary research on how animals are linked with marginalized humans in a variety of biblical contexts. Our second guest is John Barclay, Lightfoot Professor of Divinity at Durham University and a world-leading scholar of the New Testament and early Christian history. He's just finishing his term as president of TRS UK, the UK organization that brings together theology and religious studies departments and societies. He's well known for his groundbreaking work on Paul and ethics, particularly the significance of gift and grace in the formation of early Christian communities. Our third guest is Dr. Cherryl Hunt. She's an honorary senior research fellow at the University of Exeter. She is a former molecular biologist with a PhD who decided for some reason to get a second PhD in theology. A key focus of her cross-disciplinary research has been the significance of the Bible in the construction of environmental ethics. She currently works for the Southwest Ministry Training Course and continues to be interested in how people of faith read sacred texts in response to contemporary ethical issues, including the climate crisis. Thanks you all for being part of this and willing to join. The format for today's event is in two parts. First, we will start by allowing each of the speakers to talk about their own research and their interest in climate change. Following this, we will transition to a discussion with some specific questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Suzanna Miller.
Thank you very much, Sean, for that kind introduction and for inviting me to be part of this event. So I'm going to talk to you about my two main research foci, which are relevant to this topic and which Sean already mentioned in his brief bio. So first of all, I'm very interested in ecological hermeneutics in relation to the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible, so particularly Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. And it's well established that the wisdom literature contains sustained reflections on creation. So we might think of the golden texts in, for example, Proverbs 8 or at the end of Job. But I'm also interested in the other texts in those books and bringing those into conversation with scholarship outside of biblical studies. So to give you just one example, I recently wrote an article called The Ecology of Death in the Book of Job, because I noticed that when death is spoken about in Job, it's often through the language of the non-human world. So I traced four ecological images, the images of maggots colonizing a dead body. Yeah, I know it's a bit gross. Scavengers consuming the body disintegrating into dust, and plants growing and withering. And these images confuse some of our anthropocentric categories. So in that article, I interacted with theorists outside of biblical studies, as I try to do in much of my research. And I especially used the work of Donna Haraway, who's a scientifically trained feminist cultural theorist. And Haraway calls us into radical new ways of thinking. So instead of humanities, she proposes that we should say the homosities. And instead of post-humanist, she suggests compost. So she uses these images of humus and compost to suggest our connection with the non-human world in both life and death. And some of that I think we can see in biblical texts, and in particular in my interest in the book of Job. So in that article, I looked at the entanglement between life and death. how the death of one being brings life to another, be it a maggot on Job's flesh or the scavengers sucking up the blood of the slain in the divine speeches. And when the body decomposes, it brings fertility to the soil. So Job ruminates on returning to the womb of Mother Earth. And Job says there is hope for a tree, because when it dies, it will sprout again. I also looked at the entanglements of beings with each other, which challenge some of the human pretenses to self-contained individualities. So the maggots, for example, are inside of Job, and as they consume him, he is inside of them. And dusts and plants have these dispersed, mingled, hybrid bodies, which challenge conceptualizations of bodily integrity. I also have another article which deals specifically with maggots in Job, which challenges us, I think, to think really carefully about what sorts of life we value and why that is. So as Sean mentioned, I'm particularly interested in non-human animals, and that's my second major research focus. And someday I dream to bring those two things together and write an animal theology of the wisdom literature. And I'm concerned that ecological hermeneutics hasn't always given sustained attention to non-human animals specifically. In some ecological scholarship, and by no means all, but in some, all of non-human creation is kind of lumped together as, well, non-human. So rivers and mountains are placed in the same category as horses and sheep and everything else other than the human world. And I'm interested in the fact that non-human animals are actually a lot closer to humans in many ways than they are to, for example, geological formations. And so animal studies can productively draw on things like feminist criticism and queer criticism. And that we've been trying to tease out some of those similarities and differences in a book that I'm co-editing at the moment with Arthur Walker-Jones. The book is called Exploring Animal Hermeneutics, and we're structuring it according to an influential framework from outside of biblical studies in animal studies, the books by Matthew Calarco that we're drawing on. And the categories that Calarco suggests, and by which we're structuring our book, are first of all identity, so looking at the ways that human and non-human animals are very much akin to each other in these ecological entanglements. Secondly, differences, so not only the differences between humans and non-humans, but the multiple dividing lines that cut across and problematize the human-animal boundary. And finally, indistinction, so trying to find new ways of thinking and interacting that go beyond sort of binary mentalities. And also, finally, I'm just starting a research project on non-human animals in the books of Samuel. So I'm interested in the power dynamics between humans and non-human animals, and the way that these dynamics interact between the power dynamics between human groups. So rich and poor, male and female, native and foreigner. So, for example, how the institutions of human slavery and animal domestication copy from one another and employ the same mechanisms, thought processes, and practices. Or we might think about how women are closely correlated with domestic animals. So Bathsheba, for example, is parabolically figured as a lamb which is consumed, or perhaps how foreigners are dehumanized. And in all of this, I guess I want to show how the lives of humans and non-human creation are indivisibly intertwined in biblical texts as much as they are in non-biblical scholarship and in the contemporary world. So I think I'll leave my opening remarks there for now, so that we have plenty of time for our discussion.
Great, thank you ever so much, Suzanna, for that. And the interesting ideas that you're bringing to our field, but also just the new concepts by which we can view both the biblical text and the world. So I look forward to hearing more. Our second speaker is Professor John Barclay. So take her away.
Thank you very much, Sean. As Sean mentioned in his introduction to me, one of the areas of concern in my research at the moment is the theme of gift and grace. And one of the angles where my research relates to our current environmental crisis is at that deep level of our sort of thought structures of how we understand the relationship between ourselves and our environment. And I think that there are deep biblical and theological resources for pushing back against and for challenging our instrumentalizing of our environment, and therefore the damage that we do to it. So figuring nature as creation and figuring creation as gift changes the whole perception of ourselves, our lives, our meaning, and of our environment. The world we live in is not our own, and one of the biblical themes that runs right through the Bible, and including in the New Testament, is this sense that what we have is what we've been given, and just the sheer act of gratitude for our everyday life and all that we're given in it creates a sense of accountability. It creates a sense of dependence that challenges our post-industrial attitude to our world. I pick up in some of my research the work of the sociologist Harmut Rosa, who worked on the theme of resonance and the ways in which we've objectified our world so that it becomes just a thing that we use and utilize, and talks about the significance of the resonance that we find with things as we're outside of ourselves, as not at our disposal. And one of the themes, actually, although he's not a theologian, one of the themes he draws on there is the theme of gift, which of course is very important in the theological tradition in relation to how we understand creation. And I draw on the work of Catherine Tanner and my colleague Simon Oliver in that connection. Now, I think here the biblical tradition is closely comparable to lots of old religious traditions. And here I think we have the advantage in biblical studies of being able to draw on traditions that are pre-industrial, non-Western, and grow out of cultures, often agricultural cultures, which have a very, very deep sense of resonance with their environment. Neither material, so I think the biblical resources give us the ability to resist both materialism and dualism. Resist materialism in the sense that we understand all there is in this world as having depths and dimensions that go that include the material but go beyond the material. They're part of a sacred order, but also I think, as I say, the capacity to push against certain forms of dualism. Now, I recognize that the Christian tradition, and particularly some interpretations of the New Testament, have often led to a kind of dualistic sense in which the creation is simply the backdrop to some spiritualized notions of salvation. And so I think one of my concerns in my research is to maximize those strands in the New Testament that evoke the sense of all creation as gift. The hymn in Colossians, for instance, the Christ hymn in Colossians, with Christ as the integrating focus of all of reality, all created reality. The sense that as gift, all of creation has inherent value and all of equal value, that our lives are gifts, and that gifts are as gifts we are, as Suzanna was saying just now, in an interdependent relationship with every other part of the world, gifts to each other, as it were. And in that context, I think it's really important for me as I work on Pauline studies to integrate the sense of salvation and creation texts like Romans 8 become very important for me. The sense of God's giving, self-giving as a single process running through creation and the Christ gift and so on. So part of what I'm wanting to do is use the biblical material to reframe our whole understanding of ourselves and our relationship to the world, including the non-sentient parts of the world and the animal world and so on. Now, the second theme I'll just touch on briefly is really about environmental justice, because I think we're learning that our response to poverty and inequality has to be integrated with our concern to halt our damage to the environment. The ways in which the richest nations have damaged the environment, whereas the poorest nations are the first to receive the effects of that and to have lives devastated by climate change. So on top of our history of colonialism is our carbon-fueled damage to our own environment and to others. So this intersection between the New Testament concern for social justice and our environmental concern, those two are now so interwoven that everything the New Testament says about justice and about inequality has an environmental dimension, and everything that we discuss that has an environmental dimension has also a social justice phenomenon. Some years ago, I wrote an article called Food, Christian Identity and Global Warming, where I riffed off a phrase that Paul used where discussing the issue of food offered to idols. He says, if food caused the fall of my brother, I will never eat meat. And I worked from that text to say, if our diet is through emissions, if our diet is causing damage to ourselves and to others, that's a critical point in which we have to apply the New Testament beyond its own, sometimes beyond its own explicit horizons. So there are lots of resources, it seems to me, once we pick up and deal properly with the New Testament themes of justice and social justice, where we can immediately now see the environmental dimensions of those traditions and start thinking very seriously about the ways in which we are causing damage to the lives of one another around the world. So I'll just leave it there. But thank you.
Thank you, John, for your presentation and for bringing up some of those themes that I'm sure are going to be really important for our discussions in the second half of our talk. Our third presentation is by Dr. Cherryl Hunt. Hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Sean. Well, as Sean mentioned, I spent 20 years in biology before moving over to theology, having seen the light, and specifically into the area of biblical studies. And understandably, I think my interests were centered on areas where those two disciplines overlapped to some extent, both beginning and end of life issues and concerns around environmental ethics, with which I've been interested since my teens. And believe it or not, Friends of the Earth was around even when I was in my teens. There was plenty to be concerned about then, and I think there's even more to be concerned about now. So when I was working on this area, it was my great privilege to be in a project with Professors David Horrell and Christopher Southgate on a project called Uses of the Bible in Environmental Ethics. We also worked with a team of other folk who contributed pieces for this project, including Professor John Barclay, who's with us today. And we were concerned in this project with how different biblical texts had been and were being used by various biblical scholars and theologians to consider environmental ethics, And some of the texts we looked at were academic texts, but we also looked at some more popular accounts of topic designed for people who were interested in the churches. One point that we noted very quickly was that there were plenty of relevant passages in the biblical texts, both in the Old and the New Testament. But there was a tendency in some writings to read through what seemed to be a bit of a green filter. So there were some instances where what we might call browner texts were ignored, and the green texts were prioritized, if you like, over those where the earth was apparently less valued or not considered as important with regard to humanity. Also, there was a tendency in some cases to read, not exactly just read things into the text, but sometimes to interpret them in a certain way, which implied, again, a use of a bit of a green filter. One of these items is the concept of stewardship. And this is largely drawn from the Genesis texts that speak of humans having dominion and of tilling the earth or caring for it. And the dominion here, the rule, is interpreted to mean a godlike rule, a nurturing, caring rule, rather than a kind of aggressive dominion, which is the way it had been interpreted over the centuries in some cases. But the idea of stewardship emerges from this, although it's not actually in the Bible. Stewardship has become a very dominant concept in considerations of humanity's relationship with the rest of the environment. One of the several problems with the concept being, of course, that it is still very top down. It's humans not so much being dependent upon, but manipulating and organizing and looking after nature. When we came to look at the New Testament, we found that the two most frequently used texts were Romans 8, 18 to 23, and verses 15 to 20 of the first chapter, Colossians. And it's obvious when you look at the text why they are so frequently alluded to. In Romans 8, although Paul is clearly addressing humans and talking about humans, he makes reference to creation, and it's a reasonable assumption from the background of the text. This is a reference to non-human creation. Creation waiting with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God, and a hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. And we can see here there's a clear indication that this non-human creation has some kind of destiny in God's plans, and where the revealing of the children of God is interpreted as a reference to the resurrection and the end times when God will make all things well. The assumption then is that the rest of creation is caught up in this somehow. There's no detail, there's no cashing out of this idea, but it is a hint of promise that the creation is not just an environmental bubble for humans to be in. It's not just our life support system. It's not just our environment, but it has its own value in God's sight. And this is backed up by the passage in Colossians in chapter 1, where although the subject of the passage is Christ and what Christ does, the scope, the panorama, if you like, is the whole cosmos. So Christ is the one in whom everything has been made. You get this repetition of all things, tapanta in Greek. For in him all things were created through him and for him. He holds all things together. And importantly, towards the end, God was pleased to reconcile to God's self all things, whether on earth or in heaven. So there's this sense in which the rule and the work of Christ has a cosmic dimension. And this contrasts with what have been traditional Protestant readings of the New Testament over the past few centuries, which emphasize the personal salvation of individual human beings This has a much more cosmic scope. The difficulty is, of course, that neither of these scripts actually speaks directly into what kind of care humans should extend to the rest of creation. That's not what the New Testament writers are concerned with. They're concerned with humans, they're concerned with the gospel. That's not their main focus. They didn't have any kind of environmental crisis beyond the spillage from Roman mines. Paul and other New Testament writers are concerned with how Christians each other and towards those outside the church, but it's very much a human focus. So it would be a mistake to say that the Bible gives us any way we can read off how to behave towards the rest of creation. So in this project, Dave and Chris and I used these two texts that indicated the inclusion of creation as a lens to view the ethical guidance that was given as to how we should behave towards other human beings. Paul's first century audience was saying that the New Testament gives any environmental ethical guidelines, but we're reading the instructions it does give on how we act towards humans and applying them or thinking about how we might apply them towards non-human creation in light of the assumption that God's saving project includes everything, not just humanity. And using this lens to view the New Testament leads us to ask questions about how we interpret injunctions like love your neighbor and don't eat meat if it's going to upset the good of your Christian brother, the passage John just alluded to, how we might read those in light of extending that care, and extending our community of care to the other parts of creation with which we share the planet. Does it mean we should eat less meat if we don't need it to survive? Use fewer resources, leave space for ecosystems to flourish, make more attempt to prevent human-induced extinction? And of course, all of these things can be used as motivations for those within the faith tradition to act more wisely in light of the environmental pressures. But I think with climate change, actually we have a much more anthropocentric and much more human-centered motivation within the Christian tradition, because climate change is so obviously affecting fellow human beings as well as the rest of the planet, that an awareness of how our welfare is integrated with that of the rest of the denizens of this planet strengthens the case for reading these New Testament injunctions to apply more widely and to get direct ideas for action from these ancient biblical texts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cherryl, for your presentation and for sharing some of your research. We're going to be transitioning now to some more discussion that's going to be a little more informal. And the idea here is for us to be able to ask questions of each other, but also to learn from each other about how biblical studies can contribute to our understanding and our research towards ethical issues regarding the climate. So one of the questions I have that I'm just going to lead this out is, what kind of issues have you had either in your research or personal life or your classroom in which the issue of climate justice and climate, the environment? Start with Cherryl.
I was just going to say the most obvious one, which has been less of an issue in more recent years, used to be, well, is there really any climate change? So climate change denial used to be an issue, not so much with younger audiences. They seemed more ready to take on board the evidence that there was, but some older audiences were taking some persuading that there was a need for this kind of discussion in the first place. I mean, and this is obviously with outside necessarily academic settings.
Yeah, thank you. And Suzanna, you had something?
Yeah, and I suppose it's relevant to what Cherryl just said as well, where on the other hand, young people who are very concerned about it can face a sort of paralyzing helplessness with eco-anxiety, which I think is also debilitating and can't, it becomes difficult to know how to negotiate that balance between apathy and just sheer panic, and to find productive and hopeful ways forward.
Yeah, I think also for me, the challenge has been to help people acquire a kind of more holistic view of what their religious tradition is. If for students who come from a religious background, Cherryl was mentioning earlier the tendencies in Protestantism towards a kind of dualistic notion of spirit and body, or salvation as entirely anthropocentric and very individualistic. And for students, and indeed for myself, coming from that tradition, the challenge has been to widen the horizon and deepen the understanding of religious traditions, to acquire as I say, a much more integrated and holistic sense of how God and the world and history and ourselves all are part of a single web, rather than divide things into nature and ethics, or self and other, or the human and the non-human, and that's a big intellectual task. Actually, it's hugely difficult to do, and it's one of the challenges, I think, also that we're so dependent on Western perspectives in modern academia. I think one of the great things about the current situation is that beginning to listen to non-Western voices and to cultural traditions from outside our own tradition, and to understand there are quite different ways, quite different possibilities for configuring reality. In biblical studies, we have old traditions that are non-Western and pre-modern, and that provide some hints in that direction. But I think listening to indigenous voices, for instance, in New Zealand or Australia, places where I'm most familiar, and other non-Western voices, I think it's been really helpful in helping to acquire something a little bit more holistic than we're used to.
Following up from that, John, like, how do you incorporate that in your class? Obviously, I think that's a really important idea. Like, do you have how have you done that in a way that facilitates your goal for decentralizing, in a way, some of the assumptions that we've brought either from tradition or from our natural growing up in the West?
Well, for me, this takes most effect in the classroom in a course I teach on the New Testament and Christian ethics, where increasingly I see questions of social justice as being, and of wealth inequalities and so on, as being I try to put that more and more on the global scale, and also try to find ways of bring in global voices from outside our own Western tradition. So for me, it's a question of actively seeking out and taking the time to hear voices and opinions and perspectives and cries for justice from non-Western sources, the Philippines, New Zealand, Latin America.
Yeah, Suzanna, you want to?
Yeah, just to follow on from that, really, I think it's also really important for us and to make our students aware of their own social locations. I think there's this sort of preconception that a lot of people have when they go into a classroom, that this is going to be sort of the objective fact about what the Bible says. And so to begin a seminar course or a class or whatever it is, by making people very aware that actually we are just as socially located as these non-Western voices, and that we have lenses through which we read as much as other voices might do. And I actually, so this wasn't technically in a classroom, but in a Zoom room, so I hope you'll allow me to say it anyway.
Zoom is now a classroom, so it works.
There we go. But I just yesterday actually ran a scriptural reasoning group about ecology and the environment. And so we had Jews, Christians and Muslims starting from their subject position of their own religious tradition, but exploring scriptural texts together, listening to those other voices and going deeper into their own traditions through that productive interaction. So I think things like that can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Yes, and also I think, as John was saying, the ancient world of the Bible is giving us that non-Western perspective, but it's also, we sometimes find just going back into medieval and patristic writers, that sort of questioning, giving a different view on the world than we get from the post-Enlightenment times. Some of the early, one of my favorite quotes about the non-human creation comes from Calvin, and so I put the quotation up and then say to the students, you know, which tree hugger do you think wrote this? and then put Calvin's name up, and it just highlights the fact that this is not something trendy and new, and we're not doing this, thinking this way just because of the environmental crisis, but that actually this has been a strand of thought throughout church tradition and in other faith traditions as well.
John?
And one of the things, thinking about our subject position that Suzanna was talking about, one of the things that strikes me is also the very life of academia is a kind of life that's deliberately self-insulated from the realities of you know, normal human life, including our dependence on the ground, on the weather, on the whole physical realities of life. You know, in other words, academia, in cultivating the mind, as it were, encourages this kind of dualism. And I've often been envious of courses that I've known elsewhere, and you know, wondered how to integrate that, which have deliberately tried to counter that by saying part of our course is going to be actually outside, and part of our course is going to be doing physical things that explore our physical environment in a very consciously kind of non-cognitive sort of way. And I just think we need to just be conscious of the fact that the very environment in which a university operates creates a kind of distancing effect for ourselves and from our students, and for our students. And you know, I wonder whether there's ways in which we could counter that.
I think that's become particularly apparent even more so in the last couple of years with COVID, in the sense that we don't even have the physical presence of traveling and movement. Like, we've been very cooped up in that, and we don't have those personal interactions. I know for myself, I've started to crave something that's more, to be able to go outside, to be able to do certain things in a way that I was very much taking it for granted. And I think those moments of withdrawal and loss can help us to reflect upon what we want and how to reorientate. Yeah, like obviously this is a really great discussions about sort of within the classroom, and I think there are some really great resources that you guys have identified for that. I like the idea, John, about moving outside of the classroom. Being in Scotland, it doesn't really always work well with the idea of like, let's go outside. But I do think I do think there is something to be said about the panoply of learning that one can have. That's not just intellectually focused, but also integrated. Because if we're thinking about these texts often have, I think of farming metaphors and these metaphors and ideas that are drawn from nature. I think even the elite, I think Cicero and others, they talk about their estates and like how they know what farming is. They know how to do things in the ancient in the world. And I think we definitely miss part of that by being so focused and kind of removed from those environments. One of the things I like this classroom discussion, but I do want to think a little more broadly in the sense of how does biblical studies particular, but also theology and religious studies more broadly, contribute or can contribute to our discussions of the environment and climate change? You have some ideas about that. So not just only within our classroom, but also.
I think, well, I think both of my colleagues, Cherryl and John, both gave great comments on this in their opening remarks. And I actually had a question for John. He mentioned how the way that religious and theological worldviews can be shaped and reimagined by a fresh perspective on biblical texts, which I completely agree with. And he mentioned specifically this idea of gift, which is very helpful in lots of ways. But I do wonder how theologically helpful that idea is, and whether in the way that we think about gifts, it might just reaffirm anthropocentric notions. Like if creation is a gift to humanity, then that still sets up this hierarchy between them. And it might even, in Western conceptions of gift in our capitalist economic system, if someone gives me a gift, it's then mine and I own it and I can do with it what I want. So I think we can, as biblical scholars, try and help cultivate these fresh ways of thinking, but we also have to be very careful about how we do that, because if we use language which is then picked up and certain assumptions are made about it, it can have problems too.
Yeah, absolutely, Susanna. I mean, some Western notions of gift are very unhelpful in this connection. I mean, I would see it as a just to pick up your question about the anthropocentrism that's possible in that. I would want to develop the notion of mutual giftedness. That's to say, we are a gift to the animal kingdom, and the animal kingdom is a gift to us. In other words, part of our accountability to the giver is that we have responsibilities to care for all of the divine gifts, and therefore it's not absolutely not one way. It's absolutely not about, well, all of this is here for us. We are here. We are here for everything, because everything is of, as I say, of inherent value. The value is not the value for us, but the value for the creator, given by the act of creation. So it's of inherent value and of equal value. And therefore that I'd want to sort of develop those notions of interdependence, that we know is biologically the case, that we're all interdependent, and to wrap those, as it were, within a framework of gift. The point about the gift language is it places everything in a larger context of accountability and of value. That otherwise I think that we struggle to articulate sometimes, and the religious traditions, and I don't just mean the Judeo-Christian tradition, but other religious traditions too, have deep ways of thinking about the value of everything as part of this of a sacred order bigger than ourselves. So I absolutely see, there are possible dangers in that, but I also see that it's our responsibility to develop those traditions in the most helpful ways.
Quick question for clarification, John. How would you see gift differing from stewardship then, in that the idea of responsibility that you've just articulated?
Well, as I think Cherryl mentioned, stewardship is a very hierarchical model. In which there's a sort of chain of being, in which the things higher up the scale, as it were, are responsible for the things beneath them. And I would see, I would want to use different models in which, as I say, there's an interdependence and a mutuality, which is forms of equalizing relationship in which we take a place alongside, in the web of being, alongside everything else that's being created, and we dethrone ourselves from the sort of stewardship model.
I think it's interesting that a number of writers, both within and outside faith traditions, have likened changing people's approaches to environmental care as a conversion experience, and that this is something which people have to take on board arguments and reason, but then they kind of reach their own tipping point, as it were, in terms of commitment to the idea. But I do think that, or biblical studies and other academic disciplines generally, can help contribute the idea of healthy discussion, healthy debate that can go on, and where people come open to having their minds changed. That sort of, I know it doesn't always happen in academia, I know, but that sort of ideal, I think that's something that really does need to come into the climate debate in the public sphere, is very often anything but harmonious and mutually respectful. Perhaps that's something more I'm getting at.
One of the things it seems to me that we benefit from in religious studies and theology, or one we could benefit from, is we have connections to faith communities, and that's to say the link between academia and the non-academic world is potentially very strong, stronger in our subject area than in most subject areas. And that means that you can create dialogues both ways, because I think academia is too often a self-enclosed field and doesn't know well enough the movements of thought and concern that are going on outside academia. And I do think the connections that exist or can be made to exist between academic religion or academic theology and actual on the ground faith communities, including all around the world. And that's the other great thing about our subject area. It is naturally internationalized. We are dealing with texts and topics and traditions that are vibrant all around the world, and it's precisely that global perspective that we need to shake us up, because we are complicit in a form of kind of modern colonialism here, of white privilege yet again, and we absolutely need to be challenged by we absolutely need to be challenged about that.
Yeah, and I really like the idea. I think you're definitely correct, John, in the idea that we have really good contacts. We have the ability to be able to connect much more broadly and have the relationship between the academe and the rest of the world to be more porous in that way. How could we do it better then? If we do have these resources, is there ways that we can kind of continue to improve those? I'm not just directing it to John, I'm directing it to all of us. Like, how do we recognize a strength and then make it even better for us and more effective? I don't have great answers for this, so I'm actually really interested. So Cherryl, yes, and then Suzanna, yeah.
I'm obviously, many of those within religious studies have links to faith communities, and I think many of us already are involved in links in terms of going out and giving talks and trying to disseminate the interest that have arisen within the academy into the wider world, and that goes in many areas that are of public concern, such as our relationship with the animal kingdom, our treatment of strangers and migrants, those kinds of majorly important ethical issues churches want to hear on, and they want to hear from their faith texts. So I think that's something that we can just help to foster. And I think sometimes in some academic institutions, there may be a tendency to try and keep confessional communities at a distance, or their involvement in a distance, because they are, a secular environment and they're concerned to keep their intellectual independence. But I think we really need to be trying to foster those links to a greater and greater extent.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Cherryl has just said. For me, the first thing that came to my mind was that we need to learn to listen more. I think as a scholar, it's very easy to speak to people and to tell people, oh, this is what the Bible says, or whatever, but to listen to others' perspectives, to their questions, to our students as congregants, whoever. And also, I mean, I do think that biblical studies can speak to people outside of religious communities too. Obviously, we have the closest links with religious communities, but I think our influence can be wider. And I think people often have a perception of what the Bible says. And if we could help to illuminate that actually the Bible isn't clear about things, and it's a very complex document and contains these ancient traditions, which can stand alongside other really interesting worldviews from other cultures, and those things can come into dialogue rather than people just writing the biblical texts off.
Yeah, I really like the idea of listening. Something I've become more and more aware of, in the sense of sometimes when I being seen as the expert, as soon as I speak, it kind of shuts down a lot of conversation. It doesn't always encourage others to do that. We're used to having strong opinions and stuff like that within the academic world. It's normal for us to be able to be like, what do you think? I'm like, and then maybe a bit aggressive. But I'm becoming more aware that in other environments, some of the actions that we have or practices we take for granted within the academy can actually quell some of the further discussion. So yeah, I appreciate that, Suzanna. John, do you have anything to add, or yeah?
Well, I think our discipline is quite internationalized, but it tends to still have its focal area around Europe and North America. That's just kind of where the power and the money lies. And I think conscious efforts to strengthen the voice of people from a non-Western. I mean, this is where the decolonial and the decarbonizing, as it were, or the decolonial and the environmental concerns absolutely are hand in glove. The need to strengthen voices from outside of our North Atlantic hub. I mean, I've learned so much from Maori attitudes to the environment through my engagement a bit with New Zealand, and just different epistemologies, just different ways of actually understanding the whole of reality. I find extremely enriching and extremely challenging, actually, and I just think we need I don't have very, very practical suggestions here, but I think we need to find lots of practical ways in which we hear other voices. Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to be wrapping up soon, but the goal for me is to also look to the future. That's part of what COP is about. Where do you see areas that in biblical studies, research and environment going forward? What kind of things? I know you've shared some of your current research, but I'm interested in seeing kind of horizon thinking. Where might this go for us? So who wants to start?
Sure, I'll start.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think because I try and be quite interdisciplinary in my work, and I think that's where this is heading, or I hope it's where it's heading. That biblical studies will talk more to other disciplines in the biological sciences, as Cherryl is doing, or in other sciences, in things like zooarchaeology. I find absolutely fascinating, which look at animal bones and reconstructing animal societies in the ancient world. And also more broadly across the humanities and post-humanities, and so that the Bible, again, isn't written off as an esoteric thing that they do over there, but is absolutely embedded in those conversations, so that we can learn from other scholars and they can learn from us. So from a research perspective, I think that's where I would hope things are heading.
Cherryl, yep.
I was thinking, I guess, more in a kind of general within culture context. I think what Suzanna's mentioned sounds really fascinating. Oh, I'd like to do some of that. That sounds fun. I'm just thinking more in terms of public engagement. I think that within, not just within the faith communities, but within our wider society, there are riches to be found, not just in the Christian tradition, but as John says, in some of the other faith traditions, all of which I think are now engaging to various extents in this subject. And maybe there's space for some ecumenical textual work that draws together the responses of the different faith groups, as we've seen. I know at COP26 that a lot of them are have made presentations to get together and separately, but I think maybe there's more scope for that as we learn to read our own text, and perhaps learning to read or beginning to hear what others are saying of their own text. That is a potential way forward.
And just to add another angle here, I mean, I think the whole ethical dimensions of this, I mean, we handle texts which have extremely sharp, extremely polemical, and extremely insightful ethical critiques of injustice. You know, both in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. And the application of those, the development of those, and the application of those to the contemporary injustices created by the climate crisis and created by us, frankly, in the richest nations. I just think we're going to have to wake up to a set of kind of moral imperatives and moral responsibilities that that can't be shied away from, and I think the reworking of those biblical traditions in the classroom and in the public domain, I think is going to be crucial.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for being willing to chat and to be able to share your ideas. And so, on behalf of the University of Glasgow and Theology of Religious Studies, I thank you for your time. And I look forward to hearing more from you in the future. Thank you again.